Okay, here we go. So, because the class is technically called philosophical issues, we are going to actually involve ourselves mostly in two issues. One of them is personal identity, and that's going to be the main issue. So, for I think 2/3 of the course, the issue that we're going to be tackling is personal identity. But we are going to cover another issue towards the end, and that is the issue of God's existence. Um, so basically, we're dealing with mostly two issues: personal identity as well as God's existence. All of this raises the question, what is a philosophical issue? And I'm going to mute everyone because I'm recording this for a second. So if you have any comments that you want to say on the phone, just hold off for about 10 minutes or type them in the chat. Um, so it raises the question: well, what are philosophical issues, right? What are we dealing with here? And there's a, I mean, that question has a lot of answers. It's very complicated as to what a philosophical issue is. But one very key aspect of philosophical issues is that they do involve questions of existence. So let me put that as the first point here. And again, you can write this down if you want. You can take notes if you want, but I will send. Remember, I will send a PowerPoint for this, as well as the recording. Let me make that a little bit larger. So, they are issues of existence, and what I mean by that is that philosophers are concerned with whether certain things exist or not. We do believe that, probably what you think exists, and we have a lot in common in terms of what we already take for granted as existing. But there are other things that we might disagree on. So I, for example, don't believe that there is a soul, that a soul exists, but you might. And so the question of existence is very important for philosophers. What exists is a central key question. So that is the focus in terms of philosophical issues. Now, you can easily see why God's existence is also a philosophical question. So I'll type that down here as well. Because we're dealing with questions of existence, then God's existence is a philosophical question. Again, this might be something that you might take for granted. You may have grown up religious. I did, for example. God, of course, God exists. But for philosophers, and not just philosophers, I imagine there are other people, maybe some scientists, who also think that that's a philosophical question that doesn't have a clear answer. And we'll tackle that question towards the end. We'll come back to that question of God's existence towards the end. God's existence is a philosophical issue. It is an issue that some people in religious studies might wonder about as well, because in religious studies and theology, that issue might come up as well. But I think it has more of a priority as a philosophical issue. In religious studies, most people, I suppose, will just take God's existence for granted, right? Or, well, in religious institutions, in churches and all that, that's just taken for granted, right? That's not really a question. But it is a philosophical issue. And again, the best I can do here is that it comes down to it being a question of existence. So when I say personal identity, that the issue here is going to be personal identity, then that raises the question, well, what are we talking about? What does that mean? Okay, well, the issue there is not actually so much about existence, although it will come up, because it presupposes that the person exists. Let me just say for now that when I say person, I mean there are just so many ways of saying this. There, one way of saying this is the self. In fact, the word self is very much used in contemporary philosophical debates and discussions. Another way of saying it is the I, and this is exactly what you think it means. You say this word every day. You use the word I every day, right? Um, and then there's the ego, which is probably more a way in which psychologists, more psychologists are probably more likely to use the word ego. But all these words mean the same thing. So the question of whether that exists is also a philosophical question. But personal identity actually, the issue of personal identity actually has to more to do with who is that I, who is that ego. That is going to be a major emphasis in the course. Who is that I? Who is that ego? Again, that I and that ego is presupposed to exist. We don't really have evidence that I or ego exists. By the way, we have evidence that the body exists, right? You have evidence that the body exists, but what that I or that ego is, that's a completely different question. There's the question then, basically the question then is, what is the self? Is another way to, there's just so many different ways of expressing the question. What is the self is another way of expressing it. That's another way of saying, what is personal identity? So again, when we ask that question, what is the self, right? Who is the I, right? Who is the I that says I every day? That self is already presupposed, right? It's already, if you ask that question, if anybody asks that question, what is the self? We are already presupposing that there is that self, or that there is that I, right? So that is a kind of an explicit way of expressing the issue. What is the self? What is personal identity? Let me begin by saying what philosophers, I think for the most part, or all of them, do agree on, and I think you will agree with this as well, that the self is not the body. And this is why this becomes a philosophical issue. If the self is a body, then really we wouldn't have any philosophical question, right? Because you know, that we would have the answer, right? You are your body, right? I am my body. But that's not the case. Why is it that that's not the case? And by the way, I will open up this up for discussion in a bit. I'm just recording this part, so I won't ask any discussion questions yet. Why is it that you are not your body? Well, I think there are some reasons that are pretty obvious that we can give for that. Your body is just a kind of a vehicle, right? You know, we first of all, the body is more, it's physical, right? You can touch it. You can touch your body. You can see your body, right, in a mirror. You know what you look like, right? Those are reasons why the body is concrete. Is basically, I guess, what I'm saying. The body is concrete, right? We can touch it. We can see it. But when we ask about the self, we're not asking about that, right? We're not asking about that concrete thing that I just talked about, that we can see and touch. It seems that we're asking something metaphysical, right? And it is the question: is there a self? So you know, again, two things are running here. I'm running two things together here. First, the presupposition that there is such a self, that there is such an ego, or that there is such an I, and then then what is that self? What is that I? And the question of personal identity is more the latter. What is that self? What is that I? But when I ask, or when any philosopher asks, what is that I, or what is that self? That is a metaphysical question. And by metaphysics here, I mean questions about things that are beyond the physical. And again, remember, the body is physical, right? We just talked about that. You can see it, you can touch your body, you can see your body. That's how we know it's physical. But the self is not, right? The self is not physical. The I, again, the I that says I every day is not physical, right? When you talk about yourself, you're talking. So suppose you, for example, you describe your personality to someone. When you do that, you're not describing anything physical, correct? You're describing something that's beyond the physical. And so by metaphysical, I don't let that word scare you. It is a very loaded word, and it's a very, very important word in philosophy. But by metaphysical, I'm basically talking about something that is not concrete, not physical, like the body. The word meta here means beyond or above, or maybe another way to say it, it transcends the body, right? The anything that's metaphysical is anything that transcends the body, that goes beyond the body. So that is the issue. That is the issue. The issue is who is this I? Who is this self? And then it's just summarized as the philosophical problem of personal identity. That is the issue. Let me say a little bit about memory. We're going to talk quite a bit about memory. There's a philosopher who comes after Descartes, and you have heard of him, I'm sure, John Locke. John Locke, the reason you probably have heard of him would be in U.S. history or government, because his political philosophy was used as kind of a blueprint for the Constitution. But he did a lot of other things in philosophy, and one of the things is he's one of the first to bring up this issue explicitly of personal identity. So he is, after Descartes, I think he's the other major philosopher that we'll read. For Locke, basically the self is memory, and so memory plays a role. We'll come back to memory a bit, but notice that if I ask you who you are, if my question is about your personality, you're going to have to use your memory to answer me, right? You're going to have to say, well, I have a good sense of humor, and then of course you're going to say that because you remember you being that way, right? You being that kind of person. So memory plays an important role in all of this. Okay, so that's the issue. That's the issue of personal identity. Any questions on that issue